Have you ever wondered what happens when a man with everything, money, power, and success, suddenly realizes he has nothing that truly matters? One night, a millionaire's world shatters when he hears his cleaner praying behind closed doors. But it's not just any prayer. What she asks God will shake him to his core and change his life forever. Richard Morgan stood in front of the tall glass window of his Manhattan skyscraper office, the city sprawling endlessly beneath him. From the 40th floor, the millions of lives rushing through the streets looked almost insignificant, like tiny dots moving without purpose. To him, it was just noise, another day in New York. He straightened the knot of his expensive Italian silk tie, a gift he had once bought for himself after closing a major deal. At 55 years old, Richard had everything most men would envy. 3 thriving corporations, a personal fortune of over $200 million, and an office that touched the clouds. And yet, he felt the same emptiness that had haunted him for years, a loneliness so sharp that it cut deeper than any financial loss he had ever endured. The intercom buzzed, breaking his heavy thoughts. "Mr. Morgan, the cleaner is here," his secretary's calm voice announced. "Send her in." "I've got a meeting in an hour," Richard replied, without lifting his eyes from the stack of contracts on his desk. The heavy door opened, and Emily Sanders walked in, pushing a metal cleaning cart that rattled softly against the marble floor. She was 28, young but already bearing the weight of responsibility in her tired eyes. Her chestnut hair was tied neatly into a ponytail, and though her uniform was plain, a navy blue shirt and slacks, it was spotless, ironed with care. For 2 years she had worked in this office, always arriving on time, never speaking more than necessary, and leaving quietly after her shift. To Richard, she was part of the background, the plants, the polished wood, the framed art. He rarely noticed her. She was just another employee, one of many who kept the empire running from the shadows. Emily moved with quiet precision. Every wipe of her cloth across the shelves was gentle, almost reverent, as though the books and awards on display were treasures. She bent to dust the corners no one else would have noticed, her focus absolute. But Richard never looked up. His fingers typed across the keyboard, his eyes locked on numbers that defined power, success, and survival. Then, the shrill ring of his desk phone pierced the silence. Richard pressed the receiver to his ear. The voice that answered was clinical, calm, yet carried the weight of disaster. "Mr. Morgan, this is St. Mary's Hospital. Your father has suffered a heart attack. He's in the ICU. For a moment, Richard couldn't breathe. His chest clenched, and the office around him seemed to vanish. His father, his stubborn, proud father, whom he hadn't spoken to in 5 long years, was fighting for his life. 5 years of silence, of words thrown in anger, of doors slammed shut. And now this. How is he? Richard's voice cracked, trembling against the mask of control he always wore. "His condition is critical. We advise you to come immediately." His hand shook as he hung up the phone. The man who had conquered boardrooms, who had built an empire with sheer will, now stood trembling like a child, lost in the dark. Behind him, Emily had stopped moving. She hadn't meant to overhear, but her body froze at the tone in his voice. Slowly she spoke, her words careful, respectful. "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't mean to listen in. But are you all right?" Richard turned, his eyes glassy. "It's my father," he admitted, the words almost foreign on his tongue. For a brief moment their eyes met. In Emily's gaze there was no calculation, no curiosity, only compassion, real, raw and human. It startled him that someone so unnoticed, someone whose name he barely remembered, could look at him with such genuine concern. Without another word, he snatched his jacket, his polished shoes echoing sharply against the marble floor as he rushed out the door. For the first time in years, Richard Morgan wasn't thinking of meetings, contracts, or millions of dollars. He was just a son, afraid he might be too late. The black sedan cut through the Manhattan traffic like a blade, but to Richard Morgan, every red light felt like a deliberate punishment, every minute ticking away like a cruel reminder of the years he had wasted. He sat rigid in the back seat, his hand pressed tightly against his chest as if trying to contain the storm inside. His father, George Morgan, a man of 70, lay somewhere in a sterile hospital room fighting for his life, and Richard couldn't shake the thought that maybe he wouldn't even get the chance to say goodbye. The silence in the car was unbearable. His driver, accustomed to Richard's stoic presence, kept his eyes on the road, but even he could sense the air was different tonight. Richard stared out of the tinted window, the city lights blurring into streaks of gold and red. For decades, New York had been his battlefield, a place where he had fought tooth and nail to rise above, to build his empire, to prove to everyone, especially his father, that he was strong. But what was strength now, when the thought of his father's frail hand slipping from this world made him feel like a terrified boy again? 5 years. That was how long it had been since he had last spoken to George. He still remembered the night vividly. They had argued in this very city, in George's old townhouse. His father had told him that success without love was failure, that money could build walls, but never a home. Richard, stubborn and burning with pride, had shouted back that he didn't need anyone, that emotions were for the weak. He had stormed out, slamming the door behind him. Neither had called the other since, and now, maybe there was no time left. The car screeched to a halt outside St. Mary's Hospital. The glowing red emergency sign loomed above him like a warning. Richard stepped out, the crisp autumn air biting against his skin, and walked briskly through the sliding glass doors. Inside, the sharp smell of antiseptic wrapped around him, mingling with the low hum of machines, hurried footsteps of nurses, and the occasional muffled sobs of families waiting in fear. At the reception, a young nurse looked up. "Mr. Morgan?" "Yes," Richard's voice came out hoarse. "Your father is in the ICU, room 307. The doctor is expecting you." He walked down the long, sterile hallway, his polished shoes clicking against the linoleum floor. Each step felt heavier than the last. He passed rooms where children lay with IV drips, where old men coughed weakly, where mothers prayed silently. The world here was stripped of luxury and pride. It was raw, fragile humanity. When he reached room 307, he froze. Through the small glass window of the door, he saw his father lying on the bed. Machines beeped steadily, wires and tubes attached to his frail body. The once robust man who had built a modest life for his family, who had worked tirelessly to provide, now looked impossibly small, dwarfed by the hospital bed. His face was pale, his silver hair damp with sweat. A doctor stepped out just then, adjusting her glasses. She looked Richard in the eye, her expression firm but compassionate. "Mr. Morgan, your father's condition is critical. We managed to stabilize him for now, but I must be honest, he may not make it through the night." The words hit Richard like a hammer. His knees almost buckled. Is there anything I can do?" "Be here. Talk to him. Sometimes patients in this state can hear more than we realize." Richard stepped into the room slowly. The sound of the heart monitor filled the silence, each beep echoing in his soul. He approached the bed and stood there, staring at the man who had shaped his life in ways he could never deny. He wanted to say something, apologize, beg for forgiveness, but the words caught in his throat. His father's hand rested limply on the white sheet. After a long hesitation, Richard reached out and held it. It was cold, thinner than he remembered, but still rough with the calluses of a lifetime of hard work. For the first time in decades, Richard's eyes welled up. "Dad," he whispered, his voice trembling. "It's me. I'm here." He swallowed hard, his throat burning. "I'm sorry. For everything, for all those wasted years. Please don't leave me yet." Hours passed. Richard sat by the bed, his expensive suit wrinkling, his tie loosened. He watched the rise and fall of his father's chest, each breath a fragile thread between life and death. He remembered their fishing trips when he was a boy, the way George had taught him to ride a bike, the pride in his eyes when Richard graduated from college. And he remembered the disappointment too, the anger, the distance, the endless pursuit of wealth that had pushed them apart. By dawn, his father's condition had not changed. Exhausted, Richard finally stood. He knew he had meetings, contracts, worth millions waiting at his office, but all of it felt meaningless. He whispered a final promise before leaving. "I'll come back later, Dad. Please hold on." Back in his office that afternoon, Richard felt like a hollow shell. The city hadn't changed. The traffic, the noise, the urgency. But he had. The numbers on his screen blurred together, meaningless figures that once defined his life. He leaned back, his mind still at the hospital. Then he heard the familiar sound of the cleaning cart rolling across the marble floor. Emily had arrived, punctual as always. She gave him a polite nod, her face calm, composed, and began her work. For a while, Richard tried to pretend to focus, but his eyes kept wandering toward her. There was something about the quiet way she moved, the care she put into the smallest details, that gnawed at his thoughts. And then something unusual happened. For the first time in 2 years, Emily stepped into his private office without knocking. Richard frowned. She never broke protocol, always respectful, always distant. He stood silently and moved toward the door, curiosity drawing him in. The door was ajar, and through the small opening, Richard saw something that rooted him to the spot. Emily was on her knees on the carpet, her hands clasped tightly, her head bowed. Her lips moved in a soft, trembling prayer. "Please, God," she whispered, "save Mr. Morgan's father. I know he looks cold, like he doesn't care, but yesterday I saw it in his eyes. He's hurting like a lost child. Give him more time. Give them a chance to heal. And if someone must go, let it be me instead." Richard's breath caught. His heart pounded wildly. This woman, a cleaner he had barely acknowledged in years, was praying for his father's life, offering her own in exchange. He stepped back from the door, shaken to his core. For the rest of the afternoon, he sat at his desk, staring blankly at the computer screen, but his mind replayed that image over and over. Emily on her knees, praying for him and his father with a love and selflessness he had never known. And for the first time in years, Richard Morgan began to wonder if all his wealth and power had blinded him to the truest form of richness, a heart that cared without expecting anything in return. Just then the phone rang again. Richard's hand trembled as he reached for it. He braced himself for the worst. Mr. Morgan. It was the same doctor. Her tone was different now. "There's been a change. Your father, he's awake. He's asking for you." Richard nearly dropped the receiver. Against all odds, his father had survived the night. And though he had always been a man of numbers and science, he couldn't help but think of Emily's whispered prayer echoing through the quiet of his office. It couldn't just be coincidence. The ride back to St. Mary's Hospital felt different this time. The night before, Richard Morgan had been consumed by fear, dread, and regret. But now, as the black sedan cut through the heavy New York traffic, there was a glimmer of something else inside him. A fragile hope. His father was awake. After hours of teetering between life and death, George Morgan had opened his eyes and spoken his son's name. Richard sat in the back seat, staring out at the skyline. The city was alive as always, horns blaring, vendors shouting, people rushing across intersections. But for the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about contracts, stocks, or his next acquisition. He was thinking about a man lying in a hospital bed, the father he had abandoned in anger, and the woman he barely knew, kneeling in his office, whispering a prayer that seemed to have reached higher powers. He replayed her words in his head. Give them a chance to heal. And if someone must go, let it be me instead. Who was this Emily Sanders, really? For 2 years, she had passed through his life unnoticed. He couldn't remember ever asking her how she was, where she lived, or if she had a family. She was just the cleaner, but in the span of a single whispered prayer, she had shaken the foundations of his carefully built world. The car stopped. Richard stepped out and walked briskly through the hospital doors. The smell of antiseptic hit him again, sharp and cold. Nurses rushed past with clipboards. Families huddled together in tense silence, and the sound of machines hummed endlessly in the background. He made his way down the long corridor, his polished shoes echoing on the tiled floor. Each step tightened the knot in his chest. When he entered room 307, his father was awake. George Morgan's face was pale, his breathing shallow, but his eyes, blue-grey, tired but alive, turned toward Richard. For a long moment neither spoke. Then George's lips curved into the faintest smile. "Richard," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "You came." The words pierced through Richard like a blade and a balm all at once. He pulled a chair close and sat down, his throat tight. "Of course I came, Dad." His voice trembled, breaking through years of carefully maintained composure. "I should have come sooner." George studied him, his expression soft. "You're older now. Wiser, maybe. I wasn't sure you'd come at all." Richard's eyes stung. He looked at his father, frail and small beneath the hospital sheets, and felt a flood of memories rush back. Fishing trips when he was a boy, his father's booming laughter, the stern lectures about hard work, the disappointment in his eyes the night of their last fight. 5 years of silence weighed heavily between them. "I'm sorry," Richard said finally, his voice cracking. "I'm sorry for the things I said, for the years I wasted. I thought I was proving myself, but all I did was push you away." George's hand, weak and trembling, reached for his son's. "I was too hard on you. I wanted you to be strong, but I forgot you were human. I should have been there. I should have said I was proud of you." For a moment both men simply held each other's hands. Years of pride, anger, and silence melted away in that fragile connection. Richard had faced hostile takeovers, courtroom battles, and corporate wars, but nothing had ever undone him the way those simple words from his father did. They talked for hours. Richard told him about his companies, his lonely penthouse, the emptiness of wealth without family. George spoke of the pride he never voiced, of the regrets that haunted him. By the time dawn painted the sky outside the hospital windows, father and son had stitched together the beginnings of something long broken. When Richard finally returned to his office later that day, his heart felt lighter, though exhaustion tugged at his body. He sat at his desk, but the numbers on the screen blurred before him. For the first time in years, business didn't seem urgent. What mattered was that he still had time with his father. The faint sound of the cleaning cart rolling across the marble floor broke his thoughts. Emily was there as always. She gave him a small, polite nod and began dusting the shelves. Richard tried to return to his work, but his eyes kept drifting toward her. He saw now what he had never seen before, the quiet dignity with which she carried herself, the careful way she handled each object, the humility in her every move. Then something unusual happened. Emily, who had always respected boundaries and never once entered his private office without knocking, stepped inside silently. Richard frowned. This was out of character. She never broke rules, always discreet, always cautious. Curiosity stirred in him, and he rose from his chair, walking softly toward the doorway. The door was ajar. Through the narrow opening, Richard saw her on her knees on the carpet. Her head bowed, her hands clasped tightly. She was praying again. Her voice was soft, trembling, but every word struck Richard like thunder. "Please, God, save Mr. Morgan's father. I know he hides his pain, that he looks unshakable, but I saw it yesterday. He's suffering like a little boy lost in the dark. Give him more time. Let them heal, and if someone must go, let it be me." Richard froze. His breath caught in his chest. His heart pounded so loudly he feared she might hear it. He stepped back silently, shaken to his core. Emily Sanders, this woman he had barely spoken to, this cleaner he had once considered invisible, was praying for him and his father with such raw selflessness that it felt almost unreal. For the rest of the day, he couldn't focus. He sat at his desk, staring at the screen, but his mind replayed that moment over and over. Emily on her knees, offering her life for his father's. He tried to rationalize it. She was religious. Maybe she prayed for everyone. But no. He had seen the way her voice broke, the way her shoulders trembled. This wasn't routine. This was genuine sacrificial compassion, and then the phone rang again. Richard's hands trembled as he picked it up. He braced himself for the worst. "Mr. Morgan?" It was the doctor. "Your father's condition has improved. Against all expectations, he's stable. He's asking for you." Richard's jaw tightened, his chest swelling with disbelief and relief. He hung up the phone slowly, then looked up. Emily was across the room, wiping the windows, humming softly to herself, completely unaware of what had just happened. She didn't know that her whispered prayer had been answered, that her faith had reached into the chaos of his life and brought a miracle. "Emily," Richard called softly. She turned, startled. "Yes, sir?" "My father." "He's better. He's awake." For a moment her face lit up, her eyes shining with pure joy. She clasped her hands together, her smile genuine and unguarded. "Thank God, that's wonderful news, sir." Richard studied her, struck by how her happiness was not for herself but for him, for a man who had barely acknowledged her existence for 2 years. She was happy simply because his father was alive. And in that moment, Richard realized something that unsettled him deeply. This woman, who cleaned his floors and polished his shelves, who lived a life so far from his own, had shown him more humanity, more love, than anyone in his glittering, wealthy circle ever had, and he couldn't ignore it anymore. The next morning, Richard Morgan returned to St. Mary's Hospital. The sunlight streaming through the wide glass windows of the lobby seemed softer than usual, almost merciful. His father was alive, stable, and waiting for him. For the first time in years, Richard felt a pull stronger than any boardroom meeting or financial deal, the pull of family. He entered room 307 quietly. George Morgan lay propped up on pillows, his breathing easier than the night before. His color had improved, though the lines of age and illness carved deep into his face. When Richard stepped closer, his father's eyes opened slowly. They met his son's gaze with a clarity that startled Richard. "Richard," George whispered, his voice weak but steady. "I'm here, Dad," Richard said, pulling the chair closer. A silence stretched between them, heavy with years of unspoken words. Finally, George broke it. "I didn't think I'd see you again." Richard's chest tightened. "I didn't think I'd get another chance." He lowered his head. "I wasted 5 years, Dad. 5 years of stubborn pride. I let my anger matter more than you." George reached for his son's hand with surprising strength. "And I wasted longer than that. I wanted you to be unbreakable, but I forgot that even steel bends when it carries too much weight. I should have been softer with you." His eyes glistened. "I should have said I was proud of you." Richard swallowed hard. "I thought if I made millions, if I built companies, if I proved myself, maybe then you'd say it. Maybe then you'd see me as enough." George's lips curved into a faint, sad smile. "I saw you, son. I always did. But I didn't know how to say the words. For hours, they talked. They spoke of the past, of fishing trips when Richard was a boy, of George teaching him to drive, of holidays that had been warm until grief and pride stole their joy. Richard confessed the loneliness of his wealth, the emptiness of penthouses and private jets without someone to share them with. George confessed his regret for letting silence stand between them, for not reaching out sooner. By the time the sun sank behind the hospital, their relationship, fractured for half a decade, had begun to mend. Richard left that evening lighter than he had felt in years. Back at the office, he walked in, expecting silence. But the faint sound of the cleaning cart rolling down the marble corridor reached him. Emily Sanders was there, as punctual as always. Her brown ponytail bobbed slightly as she moved, her face calm, focused. She nodded politely when she saw him, then turned back to dusting a row of shelves. Richard sat behind his desk, but he wasn't working. Not really. His eyes kept drifting toward her. He watched the way she arranged the books with care, the way she wiped the plants gently, as though every detail mattered. And then, for the second time, she did something unusual. She walked into his private office without knocking. Richard frowned. Emily never broke protocol. She was always cautious, respectful, distant. Curious, he stood and moved silently toward the half-open door. Through the narrow crack, he saw her again on her knees, head bowed, hands clasped tightly. Her voice floated into the room in a trembling whisper. "Please, God, save Mr. Morgan's father. I know he hides his pain, but yesterday, I saw it. He's suffering like a lost boy. Give him more time, Lord. Let them find peace. And if someone has to leave this world, let it be me instead. Please don't take his father." Richard's breath caught in his throat. His heart slammed against his ribs. Emily Sanders, the cleaner he had never bothered to truly see, was on her knees offering her life for his father's. He stepped back quietly, shaken. For the rest of the day, he couldn't focus. He sat at his desk, staring at the computer, his mind replaying the sight of her, small, humble, unseen, praying with a love and sacrifice that left him undone. That evening, as the city outside lit up in neon, the phone rang. Richard's hand trembled as he picked it up, bracing for the worst. "Mr. Morgan?" It was the doctor. "Your father's condition has improved. He's stable. Against all expectations, he's asking for you." Richard leaned back in his chair, stunned. His father had survived the night, and though he had always been a man of reason, of science, of numbers, something inside whispered that this was no coincidence. He hung up and looked at Emily. She was wiping the windows, humming softly, unaware of what had just happened. "Emily," he called gently. She turned, startled. "Yes, sir?" "My father. He's better. He's awake." Her face lit up instantly, her eyes sparkling with relief. She pressed her hands together, smiling brightly. "Thank God, that's wonderful, sir." "Truly wonderful." Richard studied her, trying to make sense of the joy in her expression. She was happy, not for herself, not for recognition, but for him, for his father, for people who had never given her a second thought. For the first time in his life, Richard Morgan, man of wealth, man of power, felt small before the greatness of another's heart. The next days blurred into routine, yet everything had changed. Richard visited his father often. They rebuilt bridges once thought burned, and every time he returned to the office, Emily was there, quiet, steady, her presence suddenly luminous to him. One Friday evening, he returned earlier than usual. Passing through the reception, he overheard a voice that made him pause. "Please, Mrs. Carmen," Emily was saying to the cleaning supervisor. Her voice was low, desperate. "Just one more week. Don't fire me. I can't lose this job. Emily, you've already missed too many days this month," Mrs. Carmen sighed. "I've covered for you, but I can't anymore." "I know," Emily's voice broke. "But my son, he's sick again. He needs me." Richard froze. Her son? He had never once thought of Emily as anything beyond her uniform. She had a child? "How old is he?" Mrs. Carmen asked gently. 5, Emily whispered. "He has pneumonia again. Please, I'll make up the hours. Just don't let them fire me." Richard's heart clenched. The cleaner who had prayed for his father, who had offered her life in exchange for a man she barely knew, was a mother, fighting not for herself but for her child. He stepped closer, his presence startling both women. "Emily," he said softly. She turned, her face pale. "Mr. Morgan, I didn't know you were here." Richard met her eyes. "You have a son?" Her lips trembled. "Yes, sir. His name is Gabriel. He's 5. He's been in and out of hospital since he was born. He's all I have." For a moment, Richard couldn't speak. Gabriel, a boy fighting for breath while his mother scrubbed the floors of skyscrapers to pay for his medicine. Suddenly, the prayer in his office made sense. Emily knew what it meant to love so deeply that you'd trade your life for another. She lived that love every day for her son, and Richard, for the first time in decades, felt something stir inside him, something wealth had never given, something he hadn't even known he was missing, a sense of purpose. That night he lay awake in his penthouse, staring at the ceiling. His father was alive. Emily had a sick child, And somewhere between her whispered prayers and her son's fragile breath, Richard Morgan realized that his life was no longer about numbers, contracts, or billions. It was about people, about love, about second chances, and he knew deep in his soul that Emily Sanders and her little boy were about to change his life forever. The following Monday morning, Richard Morgan woke with a heaviness he couldn't quite name. He had spent the weekend visiting his father at the hospital, listening to stories of the past, feeling the ache of all the years they had wasted. Yet alongside that, another thought lingered in his mind with surprising persistence. Emily. The quiet woman who pushed her cart down polished corridors, who bent her head in prayer when no one was watching, who revealed a hidden strength that unsettled him. By the time Richard arrived at his Manhattan office, the sun was already high, flooding the glass towers with golden light. His secretary handed him a folder of contracts, but his mind wasn't on the deals. Instead, his eyes instinctively sought the marble hallway, waiting for the familiar sound of wheels squeaking softly against stone. And there she was. Emily appeared at her usual hour, her cart neatly stacked with sprays, cloths, and polish. She wore her navy blue uniform, her hair tied back in the same simple ponytail. Yet Richard no longer saw her as he once had, just part of the background. Now he noticed the fatigue under her eyes, the careful way she moved, as though carrying an invisible weight on her shoulders. She nodded politely, offered the faintest smile, then disappeared into the conference room. Richard leaned back in his chair, fighting the urge to call her name, to ask questions he had no right to ask. "How is your son? Is he still sick? Do you have enough help?" He bit back the words, telling himself it wasn't his place. But then, fate, or something like it, forced the truth into the open. Later that afternoon, as he was leaving early to visit his father, Richard walked through the reception area. He heard voices, urgent, strained. He slowed his pace. "Please, Mrs. Carmen." Emily's voice broke with desperation. "I beg you, don't fire me. Just give me one more chance. I can't lose this job." Richard froze. His steps faltered, and he ducked behind a marble column, listening. "Emily," sighed Mrs. Carmen, the supervisor of the cleaning staff. "I've covered for you too many times. You've missed 3 days this month already. The higher-ups are asking questions." "I know," Emily whispered. "But Gabriel, my son, he's sick again. He needs me at the hospital." Richard's heart clenched. So it was true. The faint circles beneath her eyes. The tired way she carried herself. She had been hiding battles no one else cared to see. "Emily, sweetheart, I understand," Mrs. Carmen said gently. "But this company, I'll make up the hours," Emily pleaded. "I'll work double shifts, weekends, anything. Just don't let them fire me." The silence that followed was heavy with defeat. Richard stepped forward. "Emily," he said softly. She spun around, startled, her face paling when she saw him. "Mr. Morgan, Her voice shook. "I didn't know you were here." Richard's gaze held hers. "You have a son?" Her lips trembled. "Yes, sir. His name is Gabriel. He's 5. He has pneumonia again. He's been in and out of hospital since he was born." Her shoulders sagged. "He's all I have." The world seemed to tilt beneath Richard's feet. Emily Sanders, the woman who had prayed for his father's life, wasn't just a cleaner. She was a mother, fighting tooth and nail for a sick child while scrubbing floors to survive. Suddenly, every whispered prayer of hers made sense. She knew what it meant to love so deeply you'd sacrifice yourself without hesitation. Richard's throat tightened. For a moment he wanted to speak, wanted to say that she wouldn't lose her job, that she didn't have to beg, that she deserved so much more. But words failed him. He simply nodded and walked away, though his chest burned with unspoken promises. That evening, Richard visited his father at the hospital, but his mind was elsewhere. Even as George spoke about the past and urged him to cherish the future, Richard found himself thinking about a little boy he had never met. Gabriel. What did he look like? Was he frail, lying in a hospital bed like his grandfather had been? Did he have his mother's eyes, her quiet strength? When Richard returned to the office the next day, he sought Emily with unusual urgency. She was polishing the window in his private office when he entered. He cleared his throat. "Emily," he began. She straightened, startled. "Yes, sir?" "Your son," Richard said carefully. "How is he today?" Her eyes widened. No one had ever asked her that before. She swallowed. He's still in the hospital. "The doctors are running tests." Richard nodded slowly. "What hospital?" Her lips parted, uncertain. "The Children's Hospital, sir. In Queens." For a moment he said nothing. He simply watched her, and she shifted under the weight of his gaze. At last he spoke. "Emily, take as much time as you need. Your job isn't in danger." Her eyes filled with tears, but she quickly turned her face away, embarrassed. "Thank you, sir." "I'll make it up to you." "You don't have to," he interrupted softly. "Just take care of your son." Emily blinked rapidly, then nodded. "Yes, sir." But fate was not done testing them. 2 days later, as Richard reviewed quarterly reports, his office phone rang sharply. He picked up. "Mr. Morgan." It was Mrs. Carmen, her voice anxious. "I thought you should know. Emily's boy has taken a turn for the worse. They admitted him to intensive care this morning." Richard's chest constricted. "Which hospital?" "The Children's Hospital." "I'll be there," Richard said, slamming the phone down. He didn't hesitate. He cancelled his meetings, ignored his secretary's questions, and strode out the door. The Children's Hospital was nothing like the gleaming private facilities Richard was accustomed to. The corridors were crowded, paint peeling on the walls, families sitting anxiously on plastic chairs. Nurses hurried past, their faces drawn with exhaustion. Richard walked through it all, out of place in his tailored suit, his polished shoes echoing against the worn linoleum. He found her on the 3rd floor, sitting in a hard plastic chair beside a small bed. Emily's head was bowed, her hands gently clasping a tiny hand. The boy was frail, thin, his chest rising and falling with the aid of oxygen tubes. His hair was the same chestnut shade as his mother's, his cheeks pale, his eyelids fluttering in restless dreams. "Emily," Richard said softly from the doorway. She looked up, startled, her eyes swollen from crying. "Mr. Morgan, you shouldn't be here." "I had to come," he replied, stepping inside. He looked at the boy, then back at her. "This is Gabriel." She nodded, her lips trembling. "Yes, sir." "My little boy." Richard approached the bed slowly. He reached out, brushing his fingers lightly against the rail. The child stirred, opening his eyes slightly. They were large, dark, curious. "Who's he, Mom?" Gabriel whispered weakly. Emily hesitated. "He's a friend, sweetheart." "A friend of Mommy's," Richard smiled faintly. "Hello, Gabriel." "I'm Richard." The boy studied him for a moment, then whispered, "You look rich." Emily flushed crimson. "Gabriel," but Richard chuckled softly. "Well, I suppose I am." He leaned closer. "Why do you say that?" Gabriel's lips curved into the faintest smile. "Your clothes, and you smell nice. Rich people smell nice." Richard laughed, surprised by the boy's honesty. Then Gabriel's face grew serious. "If you're rich, can you buy the medicine to make me better?" The words cut Richard deeper than any business negotiation ever could. He looked at Emily, whose face had crumpled in shame. "Gabriel, don't," she whispered. He doesn't understand, but Richard knelt beside the bed, his heart aching. "Gabriel, what medicine?" "The doctor says it's special. Mommy cries at night because it costs too much. But if you're rich, maybe you can—" His voice trailed off as his eyes fluttered closed again. Emily turned away, tears streaking her face. "I'm sorry, sir. He doesn't know what he's saying. Please don't think—" But Richard wasn't listening. He was staring at the boy, at the tiny chest rising with fragile effort, at the tubes and wires tethering him to life. He remembered Emily's prayer, "If someone must go, let it be me instead." And in that moment, Richard Morgan, the man who had built an empire, made a silent vow. He would not let this boy suffer, not while he had the power to change it. The sterile white walls of the pediatric ward seemed to close in on Richard Morgan as he sat beside Gabriel's hospital bed. The boy's breathing was shallow, each inhale a fragile effort sustained by the small oxygen tube fixed beneath his nose. The rhythmic hum of machines surrounded them, punctuated by the occasional cough of another child in the ward. It was a world so far removed from the glossy boardrooms and glittering galas Richard knew. Here there were no million-dollar contracts or luxurious suits, only life and death, measured in tiny breaths and desperate prayers. Emily sat hunched in the chair beside her son, her hand resting lightly on his. Her back was stiff with exhaustion, her hair loose now from its usual ponytail, strands falling around her pale face. Yet her eyes never strayed far from Gabriel's face, watching for every rise and fall of his chest. Richard studied her silently. In that moment, she wasn't just the quiet cleaning lady from his office. She was a warrior, fighting battles no one else could see, carrying a weight heavier than anything he had ever shouldered in business. A soft knock broke the silence. A nurse entered, her expression grave. "Miss Sanders, Dr. Thompson needs to speak with you." "It's about Gabriel's treatment." Emily's lips trembled. She glanced at Richard, uncertain. He leaned forward. "Go. I'll stay with him." Her eyes searched his, hesitant. Then she nodded and followed the nurse out. Richard turned back to Gabriel, who had stirred slightly, his small eyes blinking open. "You're still here," the boy whispered weakly. "Yes," Richard said, managing a smile. "I told you I'd be your friend, didn't I?" Gabriel's lips twitched. "Mom says, people like you don't stay long. Too busy." Richard's chest tightened. He thought of the endless dinners, meetings, and negotiations that had consumed his life. Too busy for family, too busy for love, too busy for the things that truly mattered. "Well," he said softly, brushing a strand of hair from Gabriel's forehead, "maybe your mom is wrong about that. Maybe some people do stay." The boy's small fingers curled around his hand. "I don't want to be sick anymore. I want to run, play soccer." His eyelids fluttered. "Mom cries when she thinks I'm asleep. Don't tell her I know." Richard swallowed hard, fighting the burn in his throat. "I won't tell," he whispered. Moments later, Emily returned with Dr. Thompson, a tall man with graying hair and tired eyes. He carried a chart in his hand, his expression serious. "Miss Sanders," the doctor began, "we've reviewed Gabriel's case. His condition is worsening because the current medications aren't effective anymore. There is, however, a new treatment available, an imported drug that has shown remarkable results in children with chronic lung conditions like his." Emily's heart leapt. Then we'll try it." The doctor hesitated. "The problem is the cost. The treatment requires a series of doses. The first round alone costs $12,000. Emily froze. The number hung in the air like a cruel joke. She pressed her hand to her mouth, her body trembling. $12,000? "Yes," the doctor said gently. "I know it's an impossible sum for most families, but without it—" He glanced at Gabriel, who was dozing again. "Without it, his condition will continue to deteriorate." Tears welled in Emily's eyes. She sank into the chair, her shoulders shaking. I can't even save that in years. I make minimum wage. How am I supposed to?" Richard stood abruptly, his voice firm. "I'll pay for it." Both Emily and the doctor looked at him in shock. "Mr. Morgan," Emily began, her voice breaking. "I said I'll pay," Richard repeated, his gaze steady. "Order the medication. Start the treatment immediately." Emily shook her head wildly, tears streaming down her face. No, sir. That's too much. I can't let you—" "Emily," Richard said, his tone softening. He crouched beside her, forcing her to meet his eyes. "Do you remember the day you prayed for my father? You didn't ask for anything in return. You offered your own life for his. You saved him. Now it's my turn." Her lips trembled. "But 12,000. That's pocket change for me," Richard interrupted. "But for Gabriel, it's everything. Don't deny me the chance to do this." Emily covered her face with her hands, sobbing quietly. "I don't deserve this. I don't—" "Stop," Richard said firmly, taking her hands away from her face. "This isn't about deserving. This is about a boy who wants to play soccer, a mother who prays every night, and a man who finally understands what really matters." The doctor cleared his throat, moved. "If you're serious, Mr. Morgan, I'll have the pharmacy process the order immediately. The medication could arrive within 24 hours. Do it, Richard said without hesitation. When the doctor left, Emily remained frozen, tears streaking her face. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you do this for us? I'm just your cleaner. We barely speak." Richard looked at her, his voice steady, filled with a conviction he hadn't felt in years. "Because you taught me something I forgot a long time ago, that love and kindness are worth more than all the money in the world. And because your son deserves a chance to live." Emily's tears flowed freely. She reached out, gripping his hand tightly. For a moment, the walls between them, the walls of wealth, class, and status, crumbled. There was only a mother, a son, and a man rediscovering his humanity. That night, Richard couldn't sleep. He lay awake in his penthouse, staring at the ceiling, his mind filled with images of Gabriel's frail body, Emily's tear-streaked face, the sound of her whispered prayer. For years, he had believed his empire was his greatest achievement. But now, for the first time, he wondered if his true purpose lay not in wealth, but in what he could give. By morning, the imported medication had arrived. Richard was at the hospital when the nurse administered the first dose. He watched anxiously as Gabriel received the treatment, Emily clutching her son's hand, whispering words of comfort. Hours passed. Slowly, color began to return to Gabriel's cheeks. His breathing steadied. When he opened his eyes and whispered, "Mom, I feel better," Emily broke down in sobs, holding him tightly. Richard stood nearby, his chest aching with something he hadn't felt in decades, joy, pure and unfiltered, and in that moment he knew his life had changed forever.